The seated rockback has been my favorite core exercise for rowers since learning it from the duo of rowing physical therapists Dr. Fiona Wilson and Kelly Wilkie. I'm teaming up with my friend and fellow rowing strength coach Blake Gourlay for this demo video, as it's a favorite of his as well, and we want to combine all the different variations we use in our strength training for rowers. See the video description box below for contact information for everyone and for more information about the seated rockback. The seated rockback offers the unique combination of stable spine, mobile hips that we need to prepare rowers for performance. Most popular core exercises either have stable hips, like a plank, or mobile spines, like a crunch or a sit-up. This can be okay for general core strength, but these exercises lack specificity for the demands of rowing with a mobile hip and stable spine. Blake and I both work with many rowers who are strong in these more popular exercises, but are challenged by even the most basic level of seated rockback, and still struggle with rowing technique errors that are commonly diagnosed as poor core strength. Think about the seated rockback as the core exercise version of feet-out rowing, and connect those concepts as we go into each variation of this exercise. There are 4 main ways to progress the seated rockback, each variation of which we'll get into more in this video. All these variations and each point on the progression offers value to rowers, so start at the appropriate level for your strength and ability, and don't be in a rush to get to the end. These are our main cues for all variations of the seated rockback. Breathe low into the belly, not high in the chest and shoulders. Sit at the front of the seat with an upright torso position. Keep the ribs down and maintain pressure on the foot plate or floor. Blake is demonstrating the first level of the progression here, seated on the erg with feet in the foot stretchers and using PVC pipes for support and to help dial in the area of muscular emphasis. Do not strap your feet in. Note that Blake has the sticks angled into the ground, and he's cueing, driving them downwards to engage lat and core muscles. The next level of loading challenge is holding this position with no PVC pipes and hands in front of you, as though holding the handle, or at the release position, as Blake is demonstrating here. The next harder level is with hands behind the head. This lengthens the resistance arm and increases the mobility demands, increasing the challenge of the exercise. Rowers may flare the rib cage up at this point if they're restricted in the shoulder area and need to be cued to draw the ribs down and regain abdominal stability, or spend more time at the hands in front position. The next harder level is with hands overhead. This again lengthens the resistance arm and increases mobility demands with getting into the overhead position with ribs and shoulders down, maintaining a stable torso at the layback position. The final hardest level is holding a light weight in the hands. Stay below 10% of the rower's body weight, for example a 20-pound weight for a 200-pound rower, and likely much lighter at first. The seated rockback is an endurance exercise, not a heavy load exercise, so use as little load as needed to still maintain excellent technique. Those are the 5 main ways to increase loading from the simplest position of seated on the erg. PVC pipes offer stability and increased proprioception to learn basic coordination. Hands in front or hands at the release increases challenge by removing the stability. Hands behind the head lengthens the resistance arm and increases mobility demands. Hands overhead and then holding a lightweight overhead does those even more to increase challenge. Blake is demonstrating some more creative additional loading variations here. The first one uses a resistance band pulling the rower to the side. This is a great way for a sweep rower to train anti-rotation evenly on both port and starboard sides of the body, and to learn how to stabilize the torso independent from lateral loading at the shoulders. The next one uses a dumbbell or kettlebell held at the side. This is also training anti-lateral flexion. The final variation holds the dumbbell or kettlebell in the rack position to train anti-lateral flexion and shoulder stability while increasing the stability demands of holding the weight higher off the ground. Now we use progression of position. The next level from the erg is seated on a bench or box. Sit at the front of the seat with knees at 90 degrees. Adjust the height of the seat if needed to achieve this. Same as with the erg variation, the big technique keys are keeping upright torso posture, ribs down, and maintaining foot pressure against the floor. Let's go through that load progression one more time. We start with hands in front, then we go to hands behind the head, then we go hands overhead to increase the resistance arm, and then we use a lightweight overhead. I'm using a 4-pound medicine ball in this video. Terminate the set or take a reset if you start to commit any of the following major errors of this exercise. There's no point training from poor positions. Any strength gained won't transfer to good technique when actually rowing. I've mentioned rib flare a few times because it's one of the most common errors. Here's what it looks like with the telltale sign of the lower rib cage poking upwards through the shirt. Cue the rower to draw the ribs down towards the belt. Blake also recommends a cue of vice gripping a stack of coins. Use a simpler variation of the exercise if needed. Slumping on the seat is another common error. Just like in rowing, work to keep pressure forward and weight on the front of the seat through the whole movement. Cue the rower to sit tall on the sit bones directly under the pelvis and use a simpler variation of the exercise if needed. Some rowers struggle to sit up tall, rounding the spine to create movement instead of rocking forwards and backwards at the hips. The whole point of the seated rockback is training for mobile hips, stable spine, so go back to instruction and use a simpler variation if needed. Foot or knee lift indicates reliance on the hip flexor muscles and a shift away from the abdominal muscles that we're trying to train. Blake cues athletes to think like there's a $100 bill under your foot. Keep pressure down and don't lose it. I'll often use a PVC pipe to push lightly sideways on the athlete's feet to make sure of pressure down. However, feet and knees will lift if rowers are laying back too far and using more range of motion than they can control. Cue the rower to lay back only as far as the release position when rowing. The next level of positional challenge uses a stability ball instead of a bench or box. The ball is an unstable surface, and the rower will have to work harder to stabilize with good technique. Use the same load progression from easiest variation of hands in front to the harder variation of hands behind the head, and then hands overhead, and then holding a weight overhead. Use the same cues as the bench or box position. It can be challenging to find a stability ball that is adequate to support a heavier rower's weight with knees at 90 degrees. So if the rower is struggling with sliding around, then just stick to a bench or box and progress in other ways. So far, we've only been using the rockback as an isometric exercise while progressing in position and load to increase challenge. We can also use a movement progression using slower tempo rockbacks up to faster tempo rockbacks. Blake is back on the erg to demonstrate the actual rocking part of the seated rockback. This is a great way to help newer rowers get the movement of the drive and recovery from the hips instead of from the spine and shoulders. It's also effective for training the core muscles in the specific manner to rowing, with a stable spine and mobile hips. I also love what Blake is doing, moving his arms in a rowing motion to ingrain the technique and sequencing. This is much better than the fallaciously named Sculler's core exercise that involves flailing the arms and legs around with a rounded torso and all of the pressure on the posterior hip and trunk. We use the same load progression with a slow tempo on the erg. Rock back to the layback position and then forward to the upright or body forward position. Use hands in front and then hands behind the head and then hands overhead and then holding a light weight. Remember, don't be in a rush through the progression. Each stage offers value, so if you find yourself committing errors, use the easier variation and build up gradually in challenge. We can use the same progression of load while seated on a bench or box using a slow tempo rockback. We're going to use the slow tempo rockback in a stable seated position from hands in front, and then go to hands behind the head, and then go hands overhead, and then holding a weight. We also coach breathing during this variation. Try breathing with the rhythm of the stroke, exhaling on the rock back phase, which would be the drive, and then inhaling on the rocking forward phase, which would be the recovery. We worked on breathing deep into the belly during layback holds instead of holding the breath, and now we'll work on breathing rhythmically for our aerobically demanding sport. This may feel a little bit backwards at first, but it's worth the effort and carry over to performance. Next, you can go to the stability ball and start the load progression all over again with slow tempo rockbacks, from hands in front to hands behind the head to hands overhead to holding a weight in the hands. Again, if you can find a big enough or inflated enough ball to support the rower, or the rower struggles with sliding around, just stick to the bench or box and progress the seated rockback in other ways. Let's see the main technique errors one more time in the context of the moving rockback. If the rower cannot correct the technique to do the exercise correctly, use a simpler variation until they can do it correctly. If the rower arches the back or flares the ribs, cue them to draw the ribs down to keep the torso as one stable piece. Use a simpler variation if needed. Here's the seat slumping error as the rower fails to keep the pressure forward on the front of the seat. Cue them to sit tall on the sit bones throughout the movement. Seat slumping and back rounding can look similar, so try to identify which is which. If the back is rounding, cue the rower to sit up tall, and remember the goal of training for mobile hips and a stable spine. Here we can see foot and knee lifting much more clearly with the moving rockback than the isometric layback hold. Keep firm pressure into the floor throughout the exercise. This engages the glutes, reduces hip flexor contribution, and keeps the exercise focused on the abdominals. Foot and knee lifting can also be due to excessive range of motion. Remember, we want this to feel like the release position in torso angle at layback. Increase challenge with position, load, or tempo, not by making the range of motion longer. Now we'll go to fast tempo rockbacks as the final point of the movement progression from layback holds and slow tempo rockbacks. We can use any point in the load progression or the position progression. For example, Blake's back on the erg here with level 1 of the position progression with level 1 of the load progression using PVC pipes. Remove the PVC pipes and go to the faster tempo for the next level of challenge. Stay in level 1 position seated on the erg and go to level 3 load with hands behind the head. Now we're on level 1 position, seated on the erg, with level 4, hands overhead. Finally, we go to level 1 position, seated on the erg, with level 5 load, holding a weight overhead. As you can see, this is very challenging. Blake's quite tall, so his leverage is very challenging in this exercise to begin with at 6'8" versus my own 5'8". Again, don't be in a rush to get through the progression. Most rowers we coach use layback holds and slow tempo rockbacks, some at faster tempos, and very, very few at fast tempo with added load. Here's the level 2 position on the bench with level 1 load progression using hands in front. Think about the cadence of rowing arms and body only, and remember to sync up the breathing with exhaling on the drive and inhaling on the recovery. We can use the same load progression from the level 2 position on the bench or box using faster tempo rockbacks with hands in front and then hands behind the head, then hands overhead, and then finally holding a light weight overhead. Finally, we can use the same load progression from the level 3 position on the stability ball. This is the end of the progression for most rowers, but Blake has some additional variations for you here. We can use the erg position and hold the layback isometrically while working anti-rotation with the resistance band, then add a slow tempo rockback, still with the resistance band sweeping motion, and then finally go to the faster tempo rockback with the side resistance band. We don't use hand movement with the side-loaded rockback using a kettlebell or dumbbell, but we can still progress from slower tempo to faster tempo to increase the challenge of the exercise while training anti-lateral flexion. As you can see, there are dozens of ways to vary and progress the seated rockback exercise to keep it challenging for rowers of all ages, types, and levels. The fourth and final method of progression is time under tension. We've just been demonstrating the techniques of different variations with short clips, but when we use this in our coaching, we write sets of a time duration or a number of rockback reps. Using the position progression from different seated positions, load progression with different hand positions, and movement progression from holds to slow tempo to fast tempo, go from 3 to 5 sets of 10 seconds or rockbacks to 15 to 20 to 25 to 30 and even up to 45. Take at least 1 minute of rest between sets, during which time you can just rest or do other exercises that don't directly work the abdominal muscles. We found more success with increasing the challenge with position, load, and tempo rather than the duration or total volume beyond 3 to 5 sets of 45 seconds or rockbacks. Ultimately, the core is just one part of the long kinetic chain involved in rowing performance, so we still need to make sure we have time, energy, and recovery for training the rest of the body parts and for using the core muscles as part of the full body athletic system as well.